Yo, what's going on YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte, and today we are taking a look at the blockbuster trade that went down last night. In fact, the three-way team trade that went down last night. Ryan O'Reilly, the focal point of this deal, so we will go over all of that. The deal involves the Minnesota Wild, the St. Louis Blues, and the Toronto Maple Leafs. So I gave you guys that little weird thing there because the Minnesota Wild are a part of this deal, and they did not pick up any real assets here. The Minnesota Wild pick up a 2024 fourth-round pick from the Toronto Maple Leafs in this deal, and also retain 25% of Ryan O'Reilly's salary. So this is more of just salary circumvention. That's really what this is. I talked about this in my Boston Bruins video with Patrick Kane. You know, Patrick Kane's salary is very high, and I kind of said, listen, you trade him to this team, they retain 25% or end up retaining 50%, and 50% of that salary ends up going to the Toronto Maple Leafs. And that's what we ended up seeing here. Minnesota gets a fourth-round pick for taking up a little bit of his salary. That's really what this comes down to. The St. Louis Blues, well, they picked up a pretty big haul here. They picked up a pretty big haul for a guy in Ryan O'Reilly I didn't think had that much value on the market, to be completely honest with you. So, the Toronto Maple Leafs, the St. Louis Blues pick up a 2023 first-round pick from Toronto, a 2024 second-round pick from Toronto, and a 2023 third-round pick from the Ottawa Senators. Not to mention, they also pick up forwards from the Toronto Marlies, Adam Gaudette and Mikhail Abramov. For the St. Louis Blues, or for the Toronto Maple Leafs, they pick up Josh Pilar, who was part of Minnesota, Ryan O'Reilly, also from the Minnesota Wild in that weird three-way trade situation, and taking on 1.875 of his salary, and also picking up Noel Acciari. So let's break this down by each team. So the Minnesota Wild is kind of easy to figure out. We know why they did this. They got the draft pick for taking on salary. For the St. Louis Blues, they pick up two young forwards who spent most of the season with the Toronto Marlies. Adam Gaudette, we remember his history in the NHL. He's 26 years old. He is on a deal with he most recently played in the NHL with the Chicago Blackhawks and the Ottawa Senators last season. He spent the entirety of this season in Toronto with the Marlies, putting up 34 points in 40 games in the American Hockey League. So not too bad for Adam Gaudette. You know, there's a guy, you guys remember, he was a very good prospect in Vancouver back in the day. Not to mention Mikhail Abramov, who is still 21 years old and a fourth-round pick of the Toronto Maple Leafs back in 2019. He spent the last couple of years with the Marlies, has not yet played in the National Hockey League. Expect him to probably play at some point in the NHL by the end of this season. He's got 16 points in 34 games with the Marlies. He is a little bit more of the prospect of this deal. You know, you're looking at here, Gaudette can play center. Abramov, more of the winger brand at this point. He is definitely more of a... Oh, no, he's a center too. So Abramov and Gaudette both can play center. And considering that the Blues are trading out two centers in this deal, in Acciari and O'Reilly, this makes perfectly good sense. Again, you know, it sounds like the Blues have they've really mailed it in this year. They've said, listen, we are rebuilding this team. You know, we had our run in 2019, and this is the year we are going to rebuild this thing. And they kind of had to. You know, with Tarasenko and O'Reilly on expiring contracts, they had to make a move. And I am so annoyed by this trade because last night, about 8 hours before this trade, I made a video on my predictions where I think some of these trade deadline guys are going to end up going. And I had O'Reilly going to the Leafs. But I missed my mark on that one. That was my mistake for not posting the video. And this is what happens. So with that said, let's get to the Toronto Maple Leafs. Because obviously, the Leafs, as of today, won this trade. And we're going to talk about who won this trade, who didn't win this trade. I mean, no team makes the trade if they don't think they won the trade. But we're going to go over what I think after we talk about O'Reilly and Acciari and what they mean to the Maple Leafs. Now, what I actually said in that video yesterday was basically along the lines of just thinking of the idea of Austin Matthews, John Tavares, and Ryan O'Reilly as your top three centers is incredible. That's a really good center core. Not to mention, David Kampf is a good fourth line center. So even David Kampf as their fourth line center, there is a ton of depth down the middle. And if you have to play this team in a 6-7 game series, you are going to have a hard time winning a lot of faceoffs. And what we've seen, and hopefully this matchup doesn't come up because I think the Leafs want to stay in one of those top three spots in the Atlantic. And again, playing Tampa isn't an easy task either. But if they are going to beat Tampa and Boston in the first two rounds, you need to win faceoffs. And you look at both of those teams, what are they both really good at? They have a ton of really good centers, right? And that's where I think this is the trade that, even Kyle Dubas said a couple of years back, in his ideal world, it would have been, when he built this team, Nazem Kadri is the third line center, John Tavares, and Austin Matthews. He always had the plan of having three really good centers on this team. And things didn't work out that way, as we all know. But Ryan O'Reilly coming in really stabilizes this group. And yeah, maybe he's not he's not what he used to be. He's struggled throughout most of this season. He's played better here as of the last month of the season. And that's probably why the Blues got the value they got for him, because I am still surprised they got that much for him. But with that said, this is still a trade that I think when you look at it at the end of the day, you're looking at a deal where the Blues or where the Leafs needed to get guys that have done it before. And I also said that in my video. Who better to beat the Boston Bruins or the Tampa Bay Lightning than a guy that won the Stanley Cup back in 2019 and captained that team in Ryan O'Reilly. O'Reilly has so much experience in the National Hockey League. His time in Buffalo, Colorado, and now even here in St. Louis. He's going to bring that all with him to the Toronto Maple Leafs. And yeah, maybe he's not the best player on the ice like a Tarasenko or a Horvat, but his presence in the locker room will be noticed in Toronto. And I know they've already got a good room there, but when you have a room like Toronto has with Marner and Matthews and Tavares and that whole group that they've got there, to make an impact, you need to get a big name player. And that's what they did here. This is a good trade in that regard. Also, Noel Acciari played quite well in the postseason for the Florida Panthers last year. I think Acciari is it makes the deal a little bit easier to stomach in terms of all the assets that you gave up here. But with that said, I think the Leafs won this trade today. And the reason I say that is, what do we always say in these, even Tarasenko, in the Tarasenko and the Horvat trades? Everyone says, oh, the Islanders got fleeced, oh, the Rangers got fleeced. Yeah, but who got the best player in those trades? The Islanders and the Rangers. And who won the Gretzky trade, right? The Kings gave up a King's ransom and then some, right? Probably gave some assets even to the Queen in that deal. And they still won that trade because they got the best player ever in Wayne Gretzky. So when you look at it in that sense, again, obviously this isn't a Gretzky trade, but you get the point. The best player in the trade is usually the team that wins the deal. Now that could come back. That could come back to end up being the St. Louis Blues or the Minnesota Wild because they have those magic beans called draft picks. And that fourth round pick that Minnesota picked up that we're all goofing about could end up being the next Kirill Kaprizov. You just don't know. And for the St. Louis Blues, sort of the same thing. I mean, they have a lot of early good assets in this year's draft. A first and third in this year's draft and a second in next year's draft is a very good little group of assets for the St. Louis Blues. And when you consider the Blues' current situation, they are rebuilding this thing. They are completely doing this thing. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to hear guys like Colton Parayko's name this summer and Ivan Barbashev here before the deadline. Don't think that the Blues are done yet. Now, another interesting thing with this deal is if you were watching and keeping an eye on Cap Friendly, this deal has sort of been in the works for a little while. They re-signed Connor Timmins, which that was the big thing the other day, right, with the Tarasenko trade. Then, the other day, they put Pontus Holmberg and Wayne Simmons. They waived both of them and put them into the minors. That freed up just a little bit of cap space, moving down Wayne Simmons. Not to mention, Austin Matthews activated back off of LTIR, but Matt Murray was placed on LTIR, and that gave them the cap space to make this deal work. Now, if you look at the actual money side of things and what every team is paying up here, so Minnesota... Okay, so St. Louis is retaining 50% of O'Reilly's salary, which is $3.75 million for the remainder of this season. Now, that's not the actual payout. Most of that has already been paid out to O'Reilly, that 50%. But whatever is left, 50% of whatever's left of O'Reilly's deal, the Blues will be paying. For the Minnesota Wild, they will be paying $1.875 and acquiring that fourth-round pick. So Minnesota, again, they're paying the same amount that Toronto will be paying for the remainder of this season of O'Reilly's deal. So what's next? Now that we've talked about the deal, who could win, who could lose this deal, and I also want to mention, I'm saying that the Blues could win this deal long-term. Listen, if the Leafs win the Cup this year, the Leafs win this deal no matter what. And if they win the Cup with O'Reilly and Acciari, and O'Reilly or Acciari get the game winner in Game 6 or 7 or whatever in the Stanley Cup Finals, they won't care about any of those draft picks or prospects. But I think St. Louis as of right now, has the best chance because of the amount of prospects that they have and picks that they acquired to eventually win this deal. So now what's next? So what can the Leafs do moving forward? I think they're done. Unless they move a roster player, I think they're done here. I think that the Leafs made it a strong point to not trade Matthew Knies, and I think that was something they accomplished here. I even made mock trades talking about, Liljegren getting traded, and I know the Leaf fans weren't happy about that, and I understand a good right-shot defenseman who's a puck-moving guy, you don't want to trade those guys. I absolutely agree with that. But if you want to make a trade of a Timo Meier or a Chychrun magnitude, it's probably going to cost you a guy like Liljegren. And I think the fact that they were able to not trade any of those higher-end prospects in this deal, or even Nick Abruzzese, who was thrown out there, that's a win for the Leafs as well. And yeah, they had to give their first, second, and third-round picks for a probably rental in O'Reilly. And that's fine. That's okay. It doesn't matter for the Leafs if they win a Stanley Cup. But I think for this team, this is a move that Dubas had to make. I don't know if he keeps his job this summer if he doesn't make a move like this. And hopefully that's not the reason he made the deal. But don't think for a second that he doesn't feel that hot seat under him starting to warm up going into this spring. They have got to win a playoff series at the very least. At the very least. Because you cannot afford to keep doing this. Matthews' cup window ends next year. As well as William Nylander. They have to find a way to get those guys re-signed or traded. So this is a real good opportunity for the Leafs once again to try and win a Stanley Cup, and they have gone all in for it. What does this mean for the St. Louis Blues? We already mentioned a little bit. They're selling off, and like I said, expect them to make more moves this summer. Bill Armstrong's probably going to start even looking into deals he can make this summer by reaching out to teams here at the deadline and just getting an idea of, who's the market for, say, a Colton Parayko or some of these other guys on their roster as they kind of retool/rebuild things on the fly in St. Louis. For the Minnesota Wild, this is kind of depressing, but I think the Wild are done here. I mean, they've kind of spent up their little bit of salary they had left, and unfortunately, they're not really in a position to buy at this year's deadline. So they did the very conservative approach of taking on salary to get a draft pick without giving up anybody on the roster, Kevin Pillar, but that's not really that big of a deal here. So at the end of the day, it's not really a loss here for the Minnesota Wild in that regard, but in the sense that this is Guerin kind of telling his team he doesn't believe in them enough to go out and pick up another player for them. And I think in that sense, it is a loss for the Minnesota Wild. But with that said, let me know what you guys think of this deal in the comment section down below. What do you guys think of the Toronto Maple Leafs acquiring Ryan O'Reilly? This is a massive trade for the Leafs, and like I said, probably their last deal. The Blues continuing to stockpile those draft picks and prospects. You look at what they've got in this year's draft, it's pretty incredible. They're starting to stockpile draft picks in what is expected to be a very good draft. And the Blues, all of a sudden, are freeing themselves up of a little bit of cap space. So kind of interesting to see how the tables have turned in St. Louis. And looking right here, they've got 3 first-round picks this year, 2 third-round picks, 2 second-round picks next year, and 2 fourth-round picks. So they've got a lot of draft capital coming toward them. And I would say this is a win for the Blues as well. Guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.